Welcome to Press TV's special coverage of the ongoing protest movement in the United States. Now, police have cracked down on anti-corporate protesters camped out in Oakland, California. There have been threats of arrests in Atlanta as well. Some 500 officers in riot gear were sent to close off streets leading to the Oakland site and dismantle the camp. Now, protests that started with just one campsite in New York City have now spread across hundreds of cities across the U.S. Now, to discuss this further, we're being joined by Sara Flounders from New York. She's with the International Action Center. Many thanks for joining us here on Press TV, Ms. Flounders. Now, first of all, I'd like to get your opinion on these arrests that are being made, not just in Oakland, but we saw them taking place in Chicago earlier as well. They took place in New York. There are threats of arrests being made in Atlanta. What do they hope to achieve by these arrests?
Well, in every city where there have been mass arrests, there has also been a growth in the mass resistance. So it's hard to know what they hope to achieve, but it's certainly not, they're not achieving what they expect. The determination is very great. The demands being raised are many. Every single day in each of these cities there are demonstrations, there are targets against the banks, against the war, against the foreclosures. The almost 200 people arrested in Chicago, they're being told that while they're able to stand in a park, they cannot lie down or even sit down. Now, so of course there's an attack on the constitutional right to peaceably assemble, to air grievances, and this is under attack across the country, and yet it has not dampened the mood and the determination.
Right, let me bring in author Jeff Gates into this conversation. He's joining us from California. He's the author of Democracy at Risk, Rescuing Main Street from Wall Street. Mr. Gates, many thanks for joining us here on Press TV. Being in California yourself, do you see the protest movement being dampened at all by these protests? Are these intimidation tactics working?
Getting educated, they know something is terribly wrong. They're just not sure what, and the frustration is they're not quite sure where to direct their attention and their outrage. I would challenge those who claim this as an anti-corporate protest. So I think some people do that. You did away with the corporation that put all those assets into a partnership or sole proprietorship. The issue would still be the same. This is money being set loose to seek only one value, and that's more money. It's displacing all those values that people care about, like civil cohesion and environmental sustainability and fiscal foresight. And we've got the most dramatic division of wealth and income that we've had since 1929. So people are frustrated. They know something's terribly wrong. They're not quite sure yet where to direct their attention.
Right, Ms. Flounders, let's take a look at what Deborah Sweet, another fellow protester from the Occupy Wall Street movement, has said. She's called her arrest as a political arrest, a political detention. Is that how you view the arrests that are taking place as far as the protesters of this movement go?
Yes, they're very much political detentions. They're an effort to break the movement. I will say, though, that overwhelmingly the attempts to stop it have at this point not succeeded. Last week in New York, they said they were going to shut down all of Zuccotti Park. They claimed in order to clean it. Thousands and thousands of people showed up. As a matter of fact, stood all night in the pouring rain in order to safeguard the site. It was the largest turnout that there had been at night. Now, these demonstrations then marched to different locations around the city. There have been demonstrations against the police tactics of a stop and frisk, which regularly lead to the imprisonment to arrest records for tens of thousands, really hundreds of thousands of young Black and Latino youth. So there's also protests against those tactics, along with targeting the banks, the foreclosure policies. The Verizon workers have been many striking workers facing attacks on their pensions, Workers in contract negotiations have also joined the occupations. Workers in closed hospitals here in New York tomorrow from St. Vincent's Hospital, thousands of workers will be joining in protest against the closing of hospitals, because there's always money for banks and for war and for super profits for these big corporations, and not enough for the desperately needed social programs that the average working person needs, has paid for, and is due to receive.
Right, Ms. Flounders, in Washington, though, as far as the White House and lawmakers go, it seems like business as usual. They're discussing Obama's Jobs Act and bickering over the debt and getting busy with election campaigns. Why is this protest failing to be discussed in the hallmarks of the political lawmakers of Washington?
Well, there is a profound disconnect between Congress, the presidency, the whole electoral system, and the lives of the average person. And that is also what is fueling protests such as we have not seen before in this country. Congress, who's elected, it really depends on who can raise money from the corporations. Any elected seat in the U.S. Congress, and this is certainly true in the presidential campaigns, depends on corporate money, and that's who is served overwhelmingly.
Right. Mr. Gates, the same question to you, if I may. Why is it that this protest is not being discussed and addressed by lawmakers, by elected representatives, as it should be?
Well, it's very difficult for people to see what the problem is, because the problem is that with which they've been educated to do their seeing. They're looking at their world through this mindset, particularly in Washington, but also in education pretty much worldwide now. We've got this sort of purchasing power recession. People don't have money, they want jobs and whatnot. And the only way we know how to create money is with more debt. You know, we're already so indebted we can't afford to do that, and we don't know a way out. And our political our elected officials have been educated into that mindset, and so have the protesters. You don't have the debate framed where it can get a real solution. To simply protest against the transnational corporation doesn't get at the problem. So I think we've got to be a little more sophisticated about what the real problem is, and understand, educate both the protesters and the politicians that we've got a systemic problem that we're now spreading worldwide, and oddly enough, it's now called the Washington Consensus. So it is discrediting the U.S. as we spread it worldwide, and everywhere you go, you create oligarchies. That's part of what catalyzed the Arab Spring. Even though there was economic growth in North Africa and the Middle East, it flowed to the top 1% and 2%, both there and here. But it's not the corporate entity that's the issue, though clearly the political donations flow through that entity. Something much more systemic, so it's much more difficult to see.
Right, then, Mr. Gates, what does this mean for the future of the politicians that America has to offer at the moment if this protest movement continues in the long run? What does this mean for the politicians and the lawmakers right now that are simply ignoring this protest movement?
Well, it means they're going to have more protests, and if there were some courageous members of our Congress to concede that we've got a systemic problem, and it's been ongoing for quite a long time, that would be a great step forward. But again, if we simply direct the rage at some legal entity like a corporate entity or something like that, it's gonna miss the problem. That's just the vehicle through which the problem is operates. It's not the real problem. The problem is the mindset that says money is smarter than people. It used to be let my people go. Now it's let my money go, and let my money do whatever money does best. And rest assured, many of those protesters are telling, if they've got a portfolio at all, they're telling their investment manager, don't tell me what my money is doing. Show me the return. And to some extent, we're all part of the problem, and that's a very difficult thing for people to get, because again, they're viewing the problem through a mindset they've been educated with, and so it's hard to see that because it's that with which you're doing your seeing. I hope that's not too esoteric, but that's how it works, and it works both here and in Iran, and it works in other countries. And you're not going to solve it simply by protesting against a corporate entity. That doesn't get to the point.
All right, Ms. Flounders, another roadblock that many say for this protest movement is the lack of media attention. Many say that the media attention is now shifting away from this protest movement. Do you agree with that assessment?
Well, of course, the media in the U.S. is corporate-owned, and so that has a real impact on what is news. I do want to say something very much about it's the capitalist system itself, and it's important to address that. As a global system, it is in complete crisis and at an end, no longer able to get itself out of what cyclical crises in the past, but there is now it's so enormously productive, and yet the profits, it's true, go to a smaller and smaller and smaller handful of people, of corporations, really. There's greater and greater concentration of wealth and enormous poverty on a global scale. That's really the capitalist system, and this wave is just the first wave of people in motion who have many different demands at this point, but they will be educated by the movement itself, by putting forth demands, by awakening politically. So at least that's how I see this, as a first step of people finally breaking free of that mindset that there's nothing that they can do, or just handing their future over to politicians that are bought and paid for. And it's an important time to be in the streets and be making those links between the system itself, which feeds on and is built on war and super profits, at a time when there's also the greatest global poverty. It's a system wildly out of balance. And I do think that an awakening mood in the U.S. and internationally will be the next challenges. It won't be this one. It's too small. The concerns are too small. But it will grow, and people will wake up and make further and further questions, and also increase their demands. Their demands will become much more focused, and they'll be much more up against the system itself. So I think we look to the future while very strongly participating every day, every moment in these ongoing occupations around the country.
Right, but Ms. Flounders, this just brings us back to the question of leadership, though. Can such a momentous task be achieved without a proper leadership for this movement?
That's the greatest difficulty, and it's an enormous difficulty because there is no one organization or leadership acknowledged at this time. But it makes the challenge all the greater to get there and be part of the organizing, the mobilizing, helping to shape the demands and direction in the future.
Right, Mr. Gates, I'd like to get your opinion on this as well. Ms. Flounders just spoke of really redoing the whole system from bottom up, but there is that question of lack of leadership. How imperative is a proper leadership role for this movement, in your opinion?
Well, it'll be helpful. Certainly, it's certainly missing that now. The current leaders we have, particularly in the corporate entity, for example, they may think that they're leading a group of people and that they're managing some machinery and equipment and that sort of thing, but they're not really. What they're doing is managing a batch of money, a portfolio of funds that are invested in their company. If they do something other than maximize the returns, regardless of the effect on civil society or the environment or the fiscal condition of the country, if they do anything other than that one narrow bandwidth of values, they will lose their jobs. So you've got our current leadership in the private sector in an absolute box. In the public sector, you've got people simply don't even know how to think about this. I mean, Ms. Flounders is correct. There's a definite crisis of capitalism. We're stuck in a mindset that by our own free will, we are now freely destroying our environment, our civil society, our fiscal condition. How did that happen? And I think once we get some leadership around us to say, look, we're deceiving ourselves that we can work our way out of this in the current box we're in, that would help enormously. Simply asking that question, explaining it simply, and saying we can't get there from here. We've got to go back and say, okay, what happened? How did we get here? How do we educate ourselves into this box? How do we begin to change the law? And the first place you look to is the huge number of funds under management, as they call it. About half of that's pension funds. It's about $20 trillion just in the U.S. If you begin to manage those funds for sustainability, fiscal sustainability, civil sustainability, environmental sustainability, that's where you start. You go for the high leverage points right there. And ideally you do that in a way that quickly transitions us from the hydrocarbon economy to the solar and hydrogen economy. You start at the obvious places, make that transition, and finance it so it's broadly owned. So you begin to monetize something other than debt, so you're not stuck with debt as the only way to create demand.
Right, but having a specific leadership and specific goals, many say this is going to end up alienating some of the supporters of this movement who joined in because of its vague goals. Do you think, Mr. Gates, that given the magnitude of the resistance against this movement, can it afford to alienate some of its own supporters?
Well, I think Ms. Flounders is right. You're going to have some leadership. You're going to have to have a little more focus on this. This is a diffuse sort of dissatisfaction that covers a broad spectrum of ills, all of which are reasonable to greater and lesser extent. So how do you bring it to focus so people can say, okay, now what do we do? And I come out of the financial domain, and I think there's an enormous amount that has to be done in the financial domain. The problem is people tend to focus on the corporate entity rather than the underlying forces behind it, which again is, money's smarter than people. Just let money do what money does best. And if people can begin to educate themselves how flawed that is, and begin to do some demonstration projects in their own communities, begin to educate their own congressmen, and say we have to do something very different. Luckily, we've got one group in the U.S. that's enormously large. They don't have much of a voice, and they're not coalesced around this yet. It's called the baby boomer generation, and there's about 78 million of us. I'm at the front end of that. And so they're the ones most at risk because they're barreling toward retirement, expecting there to be enough Federal Reserve notes, enough money out there to sustain them and pay for their health care and keep them housed and that sort of thing. And it's not going to be there. So that would be a great focus for this, and a great way that the U.S. could set up a demonstration project so that other countries don't make the same mistakes we've made. And so we began to help other countries correct the mistakes they've made at our insistence by pushing this so-called Washington consensus that most Americans really had no idea was being pushed on other countries, and that includes Iran.
Right, Ms. Flounders, do you also think that getting specific goals and proper leadership will end up alienating some of the diehard supporters that this movement has managed to gain?
Well, the leadership isn't formed just by declaring it. And as I say, I see this as the first wave of protest. And this is true globally, not only here in the U.S. When you look at the process in Egypt, when you look at what the developments in Europe, these are the first steps of millions of people saying we do not accept the enormous cuts that are being demanded of us in such rich societies. When you look at the very important demonstrations going on in Greece, what happened in Spain, the rebellions that broke out in London, all over the world you have people waking up and refusing to accept that they should live in poverty, that their health care and their pensions and their education should be cut in order to feed this tiny fraction of the population who has so much money they don't know what to do with it. And they are pulling the entire global economy down. Now that level of destabilization will become clearer, and it will force people to make more radical decisions. When we say this is the first wave, it's people waking up. Worse things are coming in the economy, and that will give rise to more powerful movements for change. And new leadership will emerge from this. Of that, I'm very confident. It's not there now. And that is a great loss. We can wish for it, but not wring our hands. We got to get into the streets and be building people's organizations, putting forth more radical demands, and actually making demands. Sometimes people are in the streets raising their discontent, raising their frustration and anger, but beginning to focus this movement and also broaden it beyond many of the youth who are participating. There are all different currents of the workers' movements that are now also waking up to see workers in a contract that first marched down to these occupations. That means that increasingly workers are thinking we should be occupying even our plants, our places of work. That when we're in contract negotiations, we got to refuse to accept these ridiculous concessions that are being demanded of us. The same thing with the students. Increasingly, there's discussion of occupying the campuses, of occupying state capitals, refusing to allow the tuition increases to go through. So there are all kinds of demands on many different levels that should be put forth, and increasingly our people are discussing that on levels all over the country. And that is new. I have to say, in the U.S. before this, the silence was the biggest problem. So I think we're going to go through a very uneven process, but a rebelliousness is essential for a movement to grow.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there. I'm afraid we have run out of time. That was Sara Flounders with the International Action Center joining us on the line from New York. Also joining us from California was Jeff Gates, author of Democracy at Risk, Rescuing Main Street from Wall Street. I'd like to thank you both for your contributions to this conversation.